So my name is Kim, and I'm one of the founders of Kasatria. Our team has the privilege of representing Google as one of their engineering partners for something called the Google Marketing Platform. And without further ado, I'll go straight into it. So basically, one of the big challenges that marketers face has always been about preparing the numbers required to justify how much resources are allocated towards a particular strategic outcome, right? So in the next few moments, I will share with you some of the options on the table that you can consider to basically build a business case, but more importantly, also help you associate this with the commercial outcomes that your businesses are interested to drive so that you're able to win consideration across the board. Okay. So very quickly, the agenda for today will revolve around three main objectives, right? So number one, we want to be able to explain the impact of digital marketing to your business, right? And to do this, we need to help you interpret the metrics that you commonly observe whenever you receive reports. And last but not least, how you can actually use these data points to fuel your budget so that you're able to control performance in a more effective manner. Okay. So let's get to it. How to explain impact of digital marketing, right? So one of the first things that I think we realized under this COVID-19 pandemic is the fact that most of us are now stuck at home due to the movement control order. And because of this, one of the first things that you also realize is the fact that our screen times are starting to increase, right? And this fundamentally means that at the end of the day, advertisements always go where all of the attention is. And this refers to the fact that all of these mediums are starting to go digital. And when things are becoming digital, what you also realize is the fact that people are starting to become very impatient. They want to be interacted with literally in real time, right? And because they are seeing all of these experiences across multiple touch points, there are many form factors that you need to start taking into consideration whenever you do your engagements. But more importantly, the technology of today actually allows us to better understand our audiences as well. It's a shame that for some marketers out there, they have yet to actually leverage the opportunity to use these data points to orchestrate a superior outcome so that they can drive a competitive edge, right? And one of the things that we all realize while undertaking this process is the fact that the path to purchase, right, is starting to become very complex, right? For example, I'm a father with 4 children, and before I actually welcomed my first child, I was actually worried about, number one, what types of nutrition will be important in order to help my child grow up healthier in the tummy, right? So sometimes I would be looking at stimulus that came from TV. Sometimes I actually ask my friends about it. Sometimes I will actually take the time to do my own research and read articles, right? And sometimes I actually go into the store and ask the consultant. But in many situations, I actually start doing my own homework online, right? And fundamentally, it seems as though each individual will come through many of these touch points naturally across their journey of consideration. But if, let's say, you were to simplify this, at the end of the day, it really boils down to 3 main steps. Number one, there is always a point when the customer first realizes that you are present. Secondly, there's a point of consideration, meaning that when someone actually faces a problem, uh, they are looking for options. And if you are present during his phase of consideration, then you are able to play the game, right? And then the third phase is the point of purchase, meaning that in an ideal situation, after evaluating the price, the efficacy, and the level of service that they are intending to receive, they then decide that, I think I want to buy from you, right? So once you start mentally building this journey, I think earlier Faisal shared a very good concept talking about the theory of a sales funnel, right? And this sales funnel is usually used because at the end of the day, different teams in the marketing discipline usually have different cutoff points in terms of what they are required to do for the organization. If let's say you've worked in marketing before, Some people, their job is basically just to drive what we call footfall or traffic onto your website. And for others, their job is to decide what is the most suitable promotion to win consideration so that they can drive sales. But let's say I go to paraphrase this, like for example, in Malaysia, I think one of the biggest interests of Malaysians is food, right? So if let's say today I'm a person who sells ice kacang, right? So if you want to gain the first number called reach, let's assume that every day I only receive 100 people walking past my shop, right? So out of 100 people, let's say only 20 of them are interested in ice kacang. This means that at the end of the day, my relevance is 20%. And out of that 20, only 5 of them decided to buy. This means at the end of the day, my conversion rate is 5%. So in order to game this, right, traditionally most people would try to game the first number, which is reach. So to do this, they will run all types of campaigns, right? So if let's say after running your campaigns, from 100 people, we now have 1,000 people. This means that effectively this is a 10x increase. If yesterday there were only 20 people interested in ice kacang, today there are now 200 people because of the additional campaigns. Yesterday there were only 5 people interested in ice kacang. Today there will be 50 people interested in actually paying for ice kacang. So basically, this funnel basically allows us to identify the different stages that need to be undertaken in order to win consideration, and also the different numbers that we need to gain in order to drive the sale. So once we start planning this out, in an ideal situation, you also want to make the numbers easier for the different stakeholders to interpret. For example, what you see on the screen here is something called a tree map, right? And the tree map allows us to blend multiple dimensions to make things easier to interpret. So let me just explain. The size of the box, right, represents how many people were brought by the campaign. So in this context, right, as you can see over here, Facebook seems to drive a lot of traffic, right? The color, red means that the likelihood of buying is low. Green means the likelihood of buying is very high. So what we can interpret from here is this. While Facebook, for example, brought a lot of traffic, the quality of consideration in terms of likelihood to buy, right, is actually quite low. Whereas if you look at it in terms of this box called email marketing over here, although it didn't bring that much traffic to the website, right, the likelihood of consideration to buy was the highest. So in an ideal situation, when you talk to marketers, what you typically want to be able to use the data is to identify what we call risks and opportunities, so that you can find out what seems to be working very well, so that you can realign your budgets and spend more on that, and what seems to be not working so well, so that you can ideally figure out what went wrong, so that you can intervene and hopefully drive a better outcome. So once you start planning all of these, it is very important, as what Faizal mentioned, to start capturing data. So what types of data do you usually get? So let me just explain very quickly. Across the journey, awareness, consideration, and purchase, there's a whole bunch of metrics that matter. So let me just zoom in into awareness. So awareness is basically the point when they first realize that your brand is around. And fundamentally, the things that matter are related to expenditure, which is referring to how much did you actually spend. Impressions. What does an impression mean? Each time this ad is shown, right, this is generating one impression. So basically, for example, if let's say this ad was shown 1,000 times, this means that it has generated effectively 1,000 impressions, right? So then you will encounter another metric called click. A click is basically representing the fact that someone actually decided to click on this ad. And what you will realize is the click will usually result in someone being redirected to a URL, which is your website. So most of the time in advertising jargon, a click actually represents a visit, okay? Then sometimes you will hear certain terms like CPM and CPC. So CPM, right, actually stands for cost per 1,000 impressions. It means that, for example, if your CPM was $1, it means that it costs $1 to show the ad 1,000 times, right? And then there's something called cost per click, meaning that each time a click was generated, which is equivalent to a visit, this is actually how much it actually costs you to pay for this, okay? So now if we move on to the next stage, we have this stage called consideration, meaning that from the click, in an ideal situation, this person has actually arrived on your website, right? And in most situations, after arriving on the website, you want this person to start considering viewing your products, hopefully with the intention of finding it useful and worthy of consideration so that we can move to the purchase process. So in principle, at this particular phase, right, you're generally interested in metrics such as, number one, how many visits did it generate, right? Number two, you also want to be able to identify how many unique users actually arrive. Then earlier, I think Faisal already explained what a bounce rate meant, but let me just paraphrase. A bounce rate represents the fact that someone clicked on an ad and then arrived on your website and then chose to leave without doing anything. So think of it like sometimes, if let's say you are in a shopping mall, sometimes there's a promoter handing you a brochure, right? So if from the promoter, you decided to take one brochure, this is equivalent to a click, okay? But then after looking at the brochure, some people would decide to walk to the closest trash bin to throw the promotion. That is literally equivalent to a bounce. It meant that, number one, originally they were interested to find out more, but then after looking at the actual call to action, they decided that they lost interest. Therefore, they abandoned that process. So basically, high bounce rates, right, are actually bad news for the organization. And you definitely need to be able to keep it low so that you basically nurture as many people as possible who are interested so that they can proceed to the next step. So on top of this, you also want to be able to identify something called a product view rate, meaning that once someone actually arrives, what was their likelihood of actually wanting to look at the product? So in the shopping process, right, you will realize that there are quite a number of steps that it can be broken up to, but this is literally subject to the platforms that you're deploying. But in many situations, most e-commerce platforms also have something called a wish list and something called an add to cart rate. So add to carts are, I think, the most common one, whereby after looking at a product that you like, if you then decided to add it into the cart. So the likelihood of someone adding it to the cart, right, is another qualitative figure that indicates likelihood of someone being interested to evaluate the price with the intention of hopefully checking out to pay, right? So all these are metrics that are going to be very important when you plan your forecast. So if you move on to the next stage, then we have something called purchase. In an ideal situation, you always hear this term called conversion rate. And the conversion rate is a very fancy way of describing likelihood to buy, right? So on top of this, you also typically want to keep track of how much sales was generated, right? And nowadays, many marketers are now introducing this term called customer lifetime value, which is basically a combination of how much the customer has currently spent so far and a cumulative forecast of how much they stand to spend if they continue being your customer over X amount of years. So on top of this, in an ideal situation, as what Faisal also mentioned earlier, there are many reasons why people would leave even after they've decided to pay. If you notice in most e-commerce platforms, right, they force you to register. Some people find that irritating and they decide to leave. So in order to intervene, many people are now introducing social login, meaning that you can immediately pull your details from Google. You can immediately pull your details from LinkedIn or even from Facebook so that you can bypass this process. Then in many situations, if you're buying physical goods, you definitely need to enter a delivery address, right? So if let's say people decide to leave at this stage, right, you need to identify why so that you can potentially plan what we call a win-back strategy. And in an ideal situation, you also need to keep track of things such as average basket size, which is referring to how much typically people spend each time they make a purchase from you. So that once you start joining all the dots together, you can also calculate something called the average cost per transaction, meaning how much it actually costs to basically deliver an actual purchase on your website. Finally, last but not least, you will encounter a term called return on ad spend. Return on ad spend is basically a very simple ratio that allows you to identify what we call the differential between how much you're spending for an ad versus the sale. Okay, so what does this really mean? So a return on ad spend of 100% means you spend $1 on an ad and then it generated $1 worth of sales. This means that a return on ad spend of anything less than 100%, right, effectively meant that you lost money. Return on ad spend of 100% means you broke even. Anything above 100% means generally is a positive outcome. So mentally, you need to start keeping track of all these numbers so that you can actually gear this positively. So once you start doing this, in an ideal situation, you want to make data work harder for you so that you can fuel valuable actions. For example, if while keeping track of all the numbers, you realize that people were leaving because they saw an error, this needs to be escalated so that someone can intervene, right? And being able to differentiate between someone who has added an item into your shopping cart and someone who hasn't allows you to basically understand what they are interested in so that eventually if they leave, right, you can prepare a win back strategy to follow up. So what does this really mean? When we work for airlines, right, for example, if you notice that you were planning to travel to a location like Bali, some people will not complete the purchase process, but this doesn't mean that they were not interested in buying, you see. So if you intentionally now follow up with that intent by focusing on your itineraries related to Bali, you're now able to make your data work harder for you and drive commercial outcomes. So now that you've had a clearer idea about all of these metrics, let's just focus on how we can use this to build a marketing budget, right? So why do we bother doing all this, right? A budget is actually the last step that you typically prepare as part of what we call a digital marketing plan, right? And in order to do this, usually you have agreed on who is your target audience, what is the problem faced by your potential customers, what is the product that you have that is able to address their concern, and typically you already have a bunch of strategies and tactics that you're intending to run in order to achieve the outcome. So the budget is usually part of an additional document called a sales forecast, because in order to convince someone else to spend money, you must also talk about how much additional money that the organization will make, right? So why do we bother doing this? Because budgets, right, and the forecast allow you to do three things. Number one, clearly communicate to all of the stakeholders what is the financial outcome that is considered acceptable for the entire team. Number two, identifying the resources required in order to achieve the outcome. And number three, identifying what would be considered the minimum viable results that the organization would consider acceptable so that you can identify situations when you are underperforming and also laud the team whenever they are delivering superior results, right? So in order to start doing this, you need to start planning a few numbers, right? So let me just jump here. Right. So there are a few numbers that need to be asked by the team in order for you to start filling this up. So the first one is where you start asking the management, how much money would you consider to be a reasonable amount that the company needs to make in order for the shareholders to be happy? Some people will say 1 million, some people will say 100 million, some people will say 1 billion. Doesn't matter. Set a number first. Second question that you need to ask, in order to, let's say, achieve 100 million, how much time do we have in order to achieve this outcome? Do I have 1 quarter? Do I have 12 months? Do I have 30 days, right? And then based on our past historical information, can we assess what was the average transaction value each time someone actually made a purchase, right? And whenever someone actually saw any of our advertisements, what was the likelihood of them clicking to find out more, right? And more importantly, when someone actually arrived on the website, out of 100 people, how many actually decided to pay money and buy our products, right? And with this, can we actually identify a realistic number that will help us achieve this particular outcome? So to elaborate further, let me just jump to a sheet that I've just prepared, right? So basically later I will circulate this sheet for everyone. You can use this as a very simple template, okay? But let me just zoom in for you to see, okay? So number one, this sheet, right, allows you to automatically calculate all of the different metrics based on the parameters that you enter. For example, the sales target, all the items in yellow, right, are variables that you can enter so that you can automatically calculate the other numbers. For example, if your sales target was, let's say, 5 million, once you set this, the numbers will change. If, let's say, your average transaction value, for example, was 250 ringgit, once you set this, the numbers will change. If, let's say, for example, you set these numbers, what we actually want to be able to help you identify here is very straightforward. From your sales target and from the amount of time allocated to this, we can now immediately calculate something called your monthly sales target, right? Which is basically, for example, over here, $50 million divided by 12, right? So this means on average, right, you roughly needed to make about 4.1 million, right? So each time someone decides to make a purchase, right, if the value of the purchase was roughly 250 ringgit, this means that in a nutshell, right, you needed to generate about 16.6 thousand purchases in order to achieve your KPI, right? So the conversion rate earlier was referring to likelihood of someone buying, assuming they actually arrive on the website. So some people would say, out of 100 people, only 5% will decide to buy. No problem, you can actually set this parameter. So each time you set all these parameters, right, the numbers will change, right? So once you set this, because you already are able to identify the total number of transactions that you need to generate, right? The next thing that you also need to be able to identify is how many people actually need to come to my website in order for me to generate the kind of sale that I need based on their likelihood of buying, right? So once you set all these parameters, the numbers will automatically calculate itself, okay? So once you start doing this, what you typically want to be able to do here is this. You want to be able to put it in a 12-month forecast, right? So let me just okay. So in a nutshell, what happens is once you've gotten the numbers, typically what you want to be able to do is plot this across 12 months so that you can identify how much you need to sell every month, the types of conversion rates that you need your agency to be able to deliver, together with the type of purchases that you need to be able to generate in order to fulfill your KPI, right? So once you start preparing this in a sheet, what you typically want to be able to do here is this. You want to use these numbers in order to control and navigate the outcome based on the results that you document, right? So what does this mean? It means that, for example, let's assume that we are focusing on the results on the first month, right? If your monthly sales target was, let's say, 833K, right? But through your documentation, you realize that, hey, we generated 900K sales instead. So this is basically an 8% incremental uplift against your minimum requirement, right? So what does it really mean to the organization? It means that your sales was higher than expected, and this impacts the company in a good way. If based on your forecast, you were expecting each transaction value to be roughly 100 ringgit, but based on your actual observed result, you notice that's about 110 instead. This again is a positive differential, right? And is something that the company can look forward to. If from the purchases per month, right, you were expecting about 8.3 thousand individual purchases, but you only registered 8.1 thousand, right? So this is less by about 2.5%. Generally, this is bad, right? So once you're able to identify all the different nuances over here and plot the actual impact against the organization, this basically allows you to identify situations that were exceeding your expectation and situations that were generating lackluster results. Why do we bother? Because in an ideal situation, all the good situations that drove a positive outcome, you want to be able to plot this and write it down into a special book so that it can turn into a best practice. And all the situations that generated a negative outcome, typically you want to be able to prepare a black book that is basically a warning to your other team members so that they are mindful that this can potentially be a problem. But more importantly, each time there's a negative outcome, this can also be used as an opportunity to think back about what went wrong and what can be actually done to make this a better situation, right? So once you start planning all of this, in an ideal situation, you want to be able to plot this across individual metrics across the entire month, right? So once you plan this, for example, between your planned outcome and the actual result, if you plot this across 12 months, you can prepare a graph like this, right? So I've prepared a few examples here, but let me just zoom in so that everyone can see. So how do we interpret this particular graph? Basically, visualizations make it easier for people to spot trends. So what does this mean? In the first month, for the conversion rate, right, they were expecting, for example, a 10% conversion rate. But basically, the second number here, the green bar, represents the actual results for that particular month. So basically, anything less than the blue line means that it was underperforming. Anything higher than the blue line means that it was outperforming. So by being able to then identify the months where you were outperforming and also identifying the campaigns that were running during those months, you are then also able to do what we call a post-mortem to figure out what seems to be working very well and what seems to be generating negative results so that you can basically hedge your bets and prioritize the things that seem to give you better outcomes to drive what we call a competitive edge, right? Because anything that seems to not work is basically burning your budget without demonstrating the result that you need, right? So in the ideal situation, these things you need to stop or do less of. And things that, if for example, in December itself, right? If you notice that for some reason, these things seem to work really, really well, now is a good time to find out what you did so that you can start repeating this and hopefully demonstrate and replicate this outcome across all of the different campaigns that you're running. So in a nutshell, once you start doing this, what you want to be able to do here, just to remind you, is very straightforward. After we identify the numbers that matter, you need to start putting it into a forecast to help highlight the different milestones that you care about and more importantly, identify the minimum viable results that are required in order for your strategic plan to succeed, right? And this can only work as long as you have the progress to not only forecast, but to also track the progress. And once you start doing this, budgets are very, very important because at the end of the day, actually what the management team wants to hear is very straightforward. They only want to hear about three things. Number one, what can we do to drive more sales? And number two, based on what we're spending, how can I spend less? And then in ideal situation, earlier, let's say we forecasted to achieve the outcome in 12 months. But if I can do that in 8 months, right, would that drive a stronger advantage for the team, right? So if we can phrase all of the different benefits to focus on these three outcomes, you will definitely be able to win consideration, especially when negotiating with your management team, right? So once you start doing this, in an ideal situation, the most important thing is to actually put this into practice and change the way how your organization responds to data. And the basic principle here is this. By being able to plan your forecast, what you actually want to be able to do is observe the types of interactions that seem to be generating revenue for your organization. And more importantly, based on the kind of people they're attracting, identify which ones seem to be able to be captured at the lowest possible cost, and what types of audiences are you able to attract in the highest magnitude possible, together with their needs and problems. So if you can align these two steps together, basically you have literally modeled something called a clear understanding of supply and demand. Because supply is always referring to things that you have to sell, right? But demand, on the other hand, reflects what your audiences are interested in, right? So if you can always match these two dots together more effectively, the way you play the game will start to change. And in an ideal situation, it's basically a three-step process, right? So obviously, I think earlier throughout the discussion, some people were talking about things like marketplaces. Some of the people were talking about things like building your own website. Some of the people were also talking about things like sending out emails. So what you're referring to is something called a marketing mix, which are different touch points that you're using to drive a marketing outcome. In my personal opinion, there's no right or wrong. You should try as many touch points as possible so that you have first-hand experience on how well it performs, right? But this means that you need to start collecting information across all of the different channels where you're intending to drive a sale. And in an ideal situation, once you start capturing all these data points, you need to take the time to identify what are the risks and opportunities so that you can turn this into a hypothesis that is able to help the company make more money, right? And more importantly, all the data in the world, right, does not make sense if no one decides to do anything. So in an ideal situation, you need to be able to describe what has happened. Number two, you need to be able to predict what will happen. And more importantly, after identifying the risk and opportunity, you need to prescribe options that can be considered to address these issues so that you can drive a stronger strategic competitive edge. So across the industry, what Google has observed is the fact that for people who take advantage of data, they are able to demonstrate easily growth of more than 100% in terms of their efficiencies, right? But this requires, again, commitment. Commitment to, number one, a measurement strategy. Number two, a commitment towards preparing budgets and forecasts so that you can identify what we consider minimum expectations. But more importantly, a commitment towards considering data to actually plan what to do next. So if you start joining all these dots together, you are effectively putting the odds in the favor of your organization so that you can drive stronger outcomes, especially in an environment that is causing, I think, many businesses to face, I would say, significant challenges in meeting their revenue targets, right? Especially during the COVID today. So, in a nutshell, this is basically the methodology that is typically deployed whenever people consider planning out budgets. Do you have questions so far?
Yes, we have one in the Q&A. I think this was regarding one of the earlier slides. This one is from Lai Yi. Lai's question is, where to get the average basket size and drop-off rate in GA?
Okay, so basically your average basket size, right, is something that you would need to calculate from the data that you get from Google Analytics, right? So in a nutshell, it's very straightforward. Let's just assume that right now you have two transactions. If one transaction was worth $10 and the other one was worth $20, right? This means that it is 10 plus 20, which is 30, divided by 2, meaning that your average basket size is now 15 ringgit, right? So for the companies that we work with, they literally have a few million purchases in a day, right? So this means that you literally need to extract each individual purchase and then basically divide it based on the total number of purchases. The average basket size can be calculated before tax and after tax. So be mindful of the different ways you prefer to make the calculation so that you're able to meet the expectations of your team, right? Because plus VAT or what we call SST is very different by 6%. So that if this was like 100 million, right, you're swinging the result by another 6 million. So this can actually cause problems and misinterpretation if not calculated correctly.
Okay, cool. Another one just came in from Stanwin, so we'll just take this one, then you can continue with your presentation. So the question is, may I know how to prepare a digital marketing budget planning for a startup brand or product when there is no known data or no observed behavior? And for a startup, the conversion rate usually is very, very low, which will not tally with the spending. How to justify in the budget planning in this case? Thank you.
Okay, very good question. So let me just jump back to the Excel sheet. So the reason why I prepared this sheet was because, so maybe just a bit of disclosure. Personally, I have also applied for $1 million grants before and won it, right?
Wow.
And doing this requires you to prepare what we call a business plan, right? And preparing a business plan always also requires the inclusion of your sales forecast together with your budgeting forecast. That's why this sheet is going to be very important. You need to start asking yourself what are going to be the numbers that you intend to commit with, right? So let's say, assuming you're a startup, right? Some people have the concept of looking at the books of other stakeholders so that they can identify what we call a close equivalent. For example, if let's say you look at the financial results of, let's say, a company like Telecom Malaysia, right? If they said that, in 1 year, let's say I earn 100 million. So if you were selling a similar product to Telecom Malaysia, some people will say, okay, I might not be as big as Telecom, but my product can easily do, for example, 10% of what Telecom can do. So this means that I think my revenue should be about 10 million, right? So this is why inside here, that's exactly what I'll enter. I'll enter 10 million, right? So once you enter 10 million, the next question that you ask here is this. When I'm a startup, most of the time my VC or my investors expect me to generate an outcome within X amount of time, right? So some people will say 1 year, some people will say actually 5 years, right? So if you say this is 2 years, right, then I will change this to 24 months, right? And you will calculate accordingly, right? So once you set this, that's why if I know the revenue outcome I needed to drive, and I know how long I actually have in order to deliver this, I can calculate how much sales I need to generate every month already, right? So if you say 2 years is a bit odd lah, I usually prepare 3 year financial forecast. No problem. That's why once you enter the numbers, right, we will automatically calculate, right? Then earlier you were saying things like, I'm a startup, I haven't run this before, but how should I price it? Again, most people would refer to how much everyone else is charging, right? Let's assume, let's say you're trying to introduce, for example, an internet package, right? And you're saying that, I have very strong backers, but Telecom right now charges, let's say, $100 for 10 megabits per second, right? I intend to be able to deliver the same outcome, but I only intend to charge 50 ringgit. And that is my competitive advantage. Wonderful. So now from 250, right, I will now change this to 50 ringgit. And we will immediately calculate how many subscriptions you need to be able to generate every month in order to drive this, right? Then the next question you will ask here is this. Okay, if I now am able to ascertain how much individual purchases that I need to drive in a month, which is about 5,000, how many people do I need to visit my website so that I can actually meet this outcome? That's why you need to reverse the question. To do this, you need to identify out of 100 people, what are the odds of them deciding to buy, right? So let's say you say out of 100 people, only 2 will decide to buy. So I will set this to 2%. So once you set this value, right, immediately you can calculate how many visitors you need to arrive on the website, right? So as you start going through the questions that we were talking about earlier, this sheet allows you to calculate all of the metrics that your investors need to see to evaluate what is the minimum viable result for your business to succeed and meet the outcome that you were promising the investor, right? That's why this sheet just helps guide you through the process. It asks you the questions, and then you will automatically calculate the rest. The items in yellow are the ones that you should enter. The ones which are not highlighted are the ones that are automatically calculated, right? So this template just allows you to shortcut the process, right? Because something that we do all the time. If you speak to an accountant, they usually have the same thing as well, right? The only difference is they usually have it for the brick and mortar business, but they don't have it for a digital business, right? So you need to be able to mirror that same process so that you have the direct equivalence for your digital business so that you're able to get these numbers and table it for consideration. Hopefully that makes sense.
It does. And sometimes like the only way to move forward is to actually backtrack everything. People are actually wondering whether they can get the Excel sheet because they find it very helpful and they say it's very professional looking and detailed. Any chance of that?
Yeah. So I purposely prepare it in Excel for everyone to download later because putting it in Google Sheets, the problem here is if I allow it to be written by everybody, right? As Laureen is planning for her next cosmetic startup, and as let's say Christia is planning for her next budget, everyone's numbers are overwriting each other. So I think the Excel sheet makes it a bit easier.
Hopefully all right, super cool. Yes, it does. If you'd like to continue, that would be great. Everyone say thank you, by the way.
Okay, no problem. So once you start doing all of this, in an ideal situation, you want to be able to use all of these budgets and forecasts to outperform so that you can claim credit and basically also win stronger support from your management team, right? So let me just share with you some strategies that have worked for some of the big brands that we've been working with, right? So what happens here is this. These are, by the way, global case studies that we've orchestrated regionally for quite a number of our customers. This is for a brand that I think is familiar to all of you. It's a company called Astro. So what happens here is this. Through leveraging artificial intelligence, we were able to understand what types of content people prefer to read. And based on their preference for content, we were also able to use this to fuel and improve consideration in likelihood to buy. So let me just explain very quickly. So they actually have a website called Stadium Astro in the past, right? And this website, right, actually has all of the latest news related to football, badminton, hockey, tennis, you name it. So what happens here was this. We were able to identify what sport you prefer. I can even identify what team you prefer. So imagine something like this. If I knew you like soccer and I knew you supported a team like Manchester United, right? Would I still share with you news related to, for example, tennis, or maybe even news related to a team called Arsenal? In an ideal situation, right, if I intentionally followed up by sharing with you the most suitable content based on your preference, we are then able to drive your readership, right? So next, if I already knew that you preferred soccer and you preferred something called Manchester United, can I use this information to drive a strategic competitive advantage for the brands that work with us, right? So by working with an e-commerce partner, we were then able to, number one, identify what team you prefer and what type of sport you prefer. So let me turn this into concrete examples. If I knew you were interested, for example, in Liverpool, right, I can immediately highlight goods such as jerseys, the ball, and the boots, right, that were endorsed by Liverpool, you see. And by doing this, the likelihood of consideration will also increase. So in this context, right, they were literally able to increase their conversion rates by more than 100%. So I cannot tell you what's their actual conversion rate, but just think of it this way. If in the past, right, out of 100 people, only 2 of them decided to buy. But now, because I know their individual preference, right, I'm able to increase this from, let's say, 2% to 4%, right? And just think of it this logically. If based on a 2% conversion rate, right, let's assume that your sales is 100 million. If I could double your likelihood of buying, right, would it be logical to say that it jumped from 100 million to 200 million, right? So of course, there are a lot of different numbers that could influence the final outcome, but mentally, this is just something that you need to keep in mind. All the things that Faisal mentioned earlier during his pitch to share with you, different options and strategies to basically game the funnel, right? They are all correct, right? But in an ideal situation, if you leverage data, you are able to put the odds in your favor. And after a while, you realize that by using this data, if I can do this autonomously, this means that even when you're sleeping, right, the platform is making additional money for you, right? And this is why people start leveraging things like artificial intelligence to deliver that scale, especially after they realize that if I have a million customers arriving every hour, right, I can't hire enough people to look at the data anymore. I need to automate this, right? So this is just one of the options for consideration. Then next, but we actually have another one for an airline, regional airline called Cebu Pacific, right? So what we were actually able to do here is this. We were able to identify 3 preferences. I know where you want to go. I know who you're going to go with. And I know what you prefer to do. So let me just turn this to concrete examples. If I knew you were planning to go to Singapore, that's exactly what I sell to you. But if I knew you were planning to go to Singapore as a couple, the itinerary I change for you or suggest to you will be very different from someone who is instead traveling with little children, right? So by being able to capture all these nuances, right, we were able to improve their return on ad spend by more than 700%. So what does this really mean? It means that, for example, if I knew someone wanted to go to Tokyo and was traveling with elderly people, right, I would intentionally suggest itineraries in Tokyo that are suitable for an entourage that was traveling with elderly people. So once we did this, right, likelihood of consideration obviously increases, but more importantly, return on ad spend is a measure of efficacy in terms of campaign expenditure. So I cannot tell you what's the actual return on ad spend, but fundamentally, mentally, again, think of it this way. If the return on ad spend was 100%, it means that you spend $1, you sold $1, right? Whatever that number was, we increase it by more than 7x, you see. And this is a very, very big deal. Next, on top of this, we were also able to do this for another brand called 123RF. They're a huge player. But in a nutshell, by onboarding data related to their new purchasers and their existing buyers, in the past, the problem here was this. Their KPI was to basically drive more new buyers to their website. Okay, but the problem here is this: their campaign was not able to differentiate between someone who has already bought before and someone who has not bought before, right? And the only way you can do this is if you take the time to onboard additional data that allow you to differentiate between an existing buyer and someone who's new. So now what happens here is this: not only do we follow up based on your preferred type of product, I only target people who have never bought before, so that all of the budget, right, is geared towards addressing your KPI. Because if you sold to someone who has bought before and it does not count as part of your KPI, it defeats the purpose, you see. So we want to basically help you drive razor precision in order to meet the outcome that you want at the lowest possible cost, so that you can maximize the outcome and ideally also achieve the targets earlier. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. Kim Peng, we've got 2 minutes left. Oh,
Yeah,
okay, you're
so
done.
I'm done. Yeah.
Okay. All right, right on time. I think let's just squeeze in this one last question that just came in. So this question is, hello Kim, what is your advice for small business owners who just started out alone on how to forecast the budget? Perhaps 3 important areas to start with.
Okay, so the simplest thing to keep in mind is number one, how much do you actually intend to generate in a time frame, right? So let's say again mentally you say, I just started out, Let's say I'm planning to sell cupcakes, right? My wife makes a lot of cupcakes. She intends to sell, but no one buys, right? But despite the fact she actually wants to run a business, right? So mentally she said, okay, I think in order to maintain my lifestyle, I need to earn at least 10K, right? So then mentally 10K per month times 12 means a minimum of 120K, right? Right? But mentally, actually, you think about it, 120K is what you need to live comfortably. You expect it to be raw, clean income, right? This means that you actually now need to introduce another number. Number one, what's considered your profit margin, right? So let's put it this way, most salespeople, right, after doing business a while, they realize that their markup needs to be at least 100%. Okay, so let's say if your cupcake was $1, you need to sell it as $2, right? So mentally, if 120K per annum was required to maintain your lifestyle, this means your revenue needs to be double that. 240K worth of revenue, right? Okay, so now with 240K worth of revenue, the next question that you have here is this: how much do I allocate in order to do my promotion, right? So most people will say, out of my sales, I'm willing to allocate, let's say, 10% of my sales as part of my marketing budget. So that is the mental number that you need to have. Whether it's 10%, 5%, 20%, it's entirely up to you, right? Some people will say something like this: I'm willing to allocate up to 20% as part of my marketing budget. But out of this 20%, assuming that this was reflective of, let's say, 240K, this would actually end up as 48K that was earmarked to spend on marketing. Some people will use this as ads, or they will flip it and say, instead of paying someone to win their consideration, right, I believe in something called word of mouth. What if I actually just gave it to them cheaper, provided they introduce another friend, right? So out of that 20%, if I earmark a 10% discount for a member, get member kind of program, right? So mentally, you earmark those budgets so that you can identify what are the resources that you're willing to commit in order to achieve this outcome. So just to repeat again, number one, what is the amount that you need to sell, which is your revenue, right? Number two, you need to also be able to identify the amount of budget that you need to allocate, right? And number three, in order to plan your campaigns, right, you always need to worry about likelihood of purchase. So most of the time you have a mental number. I was attracting, let's say 10 people. Out of 10 people, 3 of them like my cupcakes, but only one decided to buy. So this means that you actually have a conversion rate of 10%. Once you have these numbers, it becomes very easy for you to plan out the forecast. So if you want more details, just download the sheet later. And then once you enter the numbers, it will enable you to immediately get the forecasts so that you can communicate to your agency more effectively. And more importantly, if you're intending to do it on your own, identify how well you're doing so that if let's say you're doing better than your agency, right, you can kill them. And if let's say you're not doing as well, right, then consider getting an agency, because principle of outsourcing always refer to, can someone do it cheaper? Can someone do it better? Can he do it faster? If that person ticks all three, right, is basically, I think, puts you in a particular seat where certain options are on the table, right? Hopefully that makes sense.
It does. Well, hot damn, this was one heck of a presentation. It was really good, you guys. Thank you so much, Peng. It was absolutely wonderful. You guys, if you enjoyed it, let's give him a virtual round of applause. Oh, he's already gone off screen, but thank you so much, Peng. I hope to see you soon. As always, you know you're a familiar face here with us at Exabytes, and you're always welcome at our events. So thank you so much. Oh, okay.
Stay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Feel free to hang out with us, okay?
Exabytes. Grow your business online.